Um, Thank you all for coming to this 8 a.m. roundtable. In the spirit of transparency, I am exhausted, not only from conferencing, but from partying at the National Women's Studies Association's QTPOC, Queer Transgender People of Color sponsored party last night. I'm not sure that I would be here if I weren't presenting with my esteemed colleagues. So this is sacred space. Our dear friends, comrades, and colleagues, Dr. Savannah Shangay and Kai Green, are unable to join us in person this morning, but they are with us in Black feminist, radical, revolutionary, anti-sexual violence healing spirit. As is the case with most of my presentations, I open with word libation, speaking and pouring words into the room to acknowledge some of the many who paved the way. Word libation in honor of all those known and unknown spirits who surround us. This is occupied land. I acknowledge the origins of this land upon which we are seated and perhaps standing, known as Atlanta, Georgia. It was inhabited by indigenous people who were the very first people to inhabit this area. They lived here for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived and were unfortunately unable to cohabitate without dominating, enslaving, raping, terrorizing, stealing from, relocating, and murdering the millions of members of indigenous nations throughout Turtle Island, which is now known as North America. I speak libation to those millions of indigenous women, men, and children, and those millions of kidnapped, enslaved African women, men, and children, whose genocide, confiscated land, centuries of free labor, forced migration, kidnapped children, raped women and men, sweat, tears, and blood make up the very fiber of the foundation of this entire hemisphere, all of the Americas and the Caribbean. This is sacred space. Quoting from the late award-winning Black feminist cultural worker and my teacher, Toni K. Bambara, the war is also being fought over the truth. What is the truth about human nature and about the human potential? My responsibility to my neighbors, to myself, my family, and the human family is to try to tell the truth. That ain't easy. We've rarely been encouraged and equipped to appreciate the fact that the truth works and it releases the spirit and that it is a joyous thing. We live in a part of the world, for example, that equates criticism with assault, that equates social responsibility with naive idealism, that defines the unrelenting pursuit of knowledge and wisdom as fanaticism. And our most recent public ancestor, well, maybe not our most recent, but one where it just really hit me, is our sister Black feminist writer, poet Ntozake Shange said, "I write for young girls of color, for girls who don't even exist yet, so that there is something there for them when they arrive. I can only change how they live, not how they think." So I acknowledge just a microscopic few of the countless known and unknown ancestors who have been engaged in resistance, a resistance that isn't often talked about in the context of radical revolutionary struggle because gender violence is often private and treated as such. In marginalized communities, gender violence isn't viewed as important as the real issues, which are multiple forms of white supremacist and patriarchal forms of violence. And yet, what I experientially know is my Black woman, lesbian body will not be safe from the eradication of white supremacy alone. If we do not work to name, interrupt, and end all forms of oppression and marginalization, none of us, and I mean absolutely, positively none of us will be safe. So good morning. My name is Aisha Shahida Simmons. I am a Black feminist, lesbian, child sexual abuse and rape survivor who produced, wrote, and directed the film No, the Rape documentary. This journey began in October 1994 and ended in February 2006 at the world premiere it ended in 2006 with its world premiere at the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles. No is a part of a centuries-long tradition of protest by Black women. And it is in this context that Dr. Kai Green came up with the idea for this panel, which he designed, curated, and invited all of us, including me, the filmmaker, culture worker, to engage in conversation about the film. So while this panel is definitely called No in the Age of Me Too, this is not in opposition to Me Too. It is really to talk about no, but also the continuum of work that all of this plays on, that started definitely since 1492, but I don't want to act as if sexual violence was not occurring before then. We can look to the religious texts, the Quran, the Bible, the Torah. We can look to it and see many instances of violence against women, children, men. So I don't want to act like it just started with the horror known as Christopher Columbus, but definitely in terms of this hemisphere and the struggles that have been going on, that anti-rape resistance in indigenous and African descendant communities has been going on for a long time. So it is in this context that no exists, that Me Too exists, and I say Me Too because people hopefully know that it was created by a black woman named Tarana Burke. So despite what is going on in the media and a lot of the whitewashing that's happening, a black woman created Me Too. So we are all a part of this continuum. So I just want to give a brief description of No because we're going to screen it and engage with my colleagues Terrion and Ahmad, but I just want to give a description. So No is a Ford Foundation film that explores the international atrocity of heterosexual rape and other forms of sexual assault through the first-person testimonies, scholarship, spirituality, activism, and cultural work of black people in the United States. It features testimonials from black women rape and sexual assault survivors who broke silences and challenged taboos that hid heterosexual rape and sexual assault in African American communities. Black women and men, violence prevention advocates, theologians, sociologists, historians, anthropologists, other leading scholars, and human rights activists provide viewers with the tools necessary to understand existing theories and politics intended to eradicate sexual violence, as well as to develop radical new forms of transformative resistance to rape and sexual assault. Impacting archival footage, spirited music, transformational dance, and performances from 3 award-winning poets, the late Essex Hemphill, Honoré Fanon Jeffers, and Samia A. Bashir, take viewers on a journey from enslavement of African people in the United States through the 2000s, early 2000s. So what we decided, Ahmad, Terrion, and I, that we thought it was really important that we screen excerpts of No. Like, we want to talk about No, but it's very important to screen excerpts of No. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a moving image is worth infinite words. So in the spirit of just honoring all of us in the room who, whether we've been impacted directly, whether our bodies have been violated against our will directly or not, based on the statistics, we know someone who has. So it's really important that we take care of each other because we are going to show 2 survivor testimonies and then talk about campus and clergy accountability. So I just want to just give that forewarning. So it's about a 15-minute clip, and then from there I'm going to introduce my colleagues, comrades, old friend, new friends, and then engage in conversation. Okay, so let's see how we get back to the menu. And, oh, I don't know what's going on, sorry. Just trying to, all right. Appropriate to see Erinette's face. She was one of the backbones behind No, and she passed away in 2012 from an aneurysm completely unexpectedly. And also Essex Hemphill was a black gay poet who died in 1995. I filmed him in June of 1995 in Philadelphia, where I'm from and live still, and where he was living. And he passed away in November. It was when I always talk to people who are interested in making films, I always say seize the moment. The format that I filmed Essex on doesn't even exist anymore. And it was, but I knew time was of the essence. And he also knew that time was of the essence. And while we filmed him, he was not well, and we had to keep doing different cuts. But it was such a profound not like a gift to know, but a gift in solidarity, in opposing gender violence, and challenging patriarchy in Black communities. It was like one of many last pearls that Essex left for us. And so he's been an ancestor since 1995, but his life, his words live on, not only in No, but in Marlon Riggs's film, and Shari Freelo's films, and Isaac Julian's films. So it's just, every time I see that, it always moves me, because I know the backstory, and it's just like, whew, he knew. I knew, but he knew, and we made it happen. So it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce my co-panelists. I'm gonna just go left to right. So first is Terrion Williamson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota, where she is also jointly appointed in American Studies and Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. Her research and teaching engage racialized gender violence, cultural studies, 20th and 21st century African American literature, Midwestern studies, and Black feminist theory. She is the founding director of the Black Midwest Initiative and author of Scandalize My Name, Black Feminist Practice in the Making of Black Social Life. She is currently working on a book about Black women in serial murder titled We Cannot Live Without Our Lives. And then next to Terian Williamson is Ahmad Greene-Hayes, who is the founder of Children of Kambihi, a faith-based organization that works to end child sexual abuse in Black church communities using womanist, queer-affirming, pastoral, and theological methods. He is also a doctoral candidate in the Department of Religion at Princeton University in the Religion in the Americas subfields, and an interdisciplinary scholar pursuing graduate certificates in African American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies. His research interests include Africana religions, gender, sexuality, and religion, Black Pentecostalism, Black queer studies, folk and popular religions, and American and Africana religious histories, specifically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In addition, he is an essayist, and his public commentary on issues of race, gender, sexuality, Black politics, and religion have appeared in The Black Scholar, Ebony, The Root, The Feminist Wire, The Huffington Post, Open Democracy, and News One, among many other outlets. His website is ahmadgreen.com, and that's green with an E. So I'm gonna sit down and join my panelists.
All right. Good morning, can you hear me okay? Good morning. You got me? Good morning, everyone. I feel really honored to be here. Really honored to be on this panel, and I appreciate you all coming out, because this is such a difficult topic anytime. And it might be particularly difficult at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And so just thank you. And so my comments, I have a little bit written, but I'm also going to talk, just sort of talk about a couple of things and my own relationship to the film before turning it over and hopefully having a conversation with Aisha and all of you. So No, the Rape documentary is a gift. It is a gift for all people who have experienced rape, sexual assault, and sexual trauma, but it is a particularly special gift for Black women who have experienced rape and sexual assault, or who are at risk of experiencing rape or sexual assault, and who among us in our long history is not or has not been at such risk. While the film aesthetically and structurally conjures comparisons to the work of many filmmakers, including the inestimable Toni K. Bambara, but it aesthetically and structurally conjures comparisons to the work of the great Marlon Riggs, whose explorations of Black life in films like Black Is, Black Ain't, and Tongues Untied continue to teach and guide us almost 25 years after his death. Aisha's No is a singular, masterful achievement, and its achievement is not only what it is, but also what it does and what it has the capacity to do. As Ornell Hurston tells us in Their Eyes Are Watching God, quote, "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." And as so many women remind us throughout the film, silence has been a particularly potent weapon in the lives of Black women. No refuses silence. It refuses to continue hiding our pain or sweeping it away, and it forthrightly exposes the conditions of that pain, conditions that are never reduced or reducible to a singular individual. And in so doing, No opens up a critically important space for voice, accountability, and healing for Black women. The first time I screened No was in spring 2012 as part of a series of events I organized with my colleague, Kristen Renzi, for Sexual Assault Awareness Month at Michigan State University. We were particularly interested in ensuring that we reached women beyond the university campus, where so much of the discussion of rape and sexual assault has been focused in recent years, and so decided to screen No at the church I was attending at the time. The conversation we were able to have with the small group of women who attended the screening, a group that included my pastor, was unlike any I'd ever had within the space of a religious institution before. Rather than the appeals to virginity and abstinence and sexual purity, appeals that were clearly the strict purview of women and girls in heteronormative relationships that had been the norm during my childhood and so much of my church life, we were able to have a conversation that did not begin or end with blame or blaming or guilt trips or any of the rhetoric that so often informs discussions of sex and sexuality within the confines of the church, but where we were able to discuss our own pain and experiences openly, wherever and however we entered into the conversation. That is the power and gift of No. So I also wanted to say, a couple of years later, I organized with my colleague Lisa Biggs a film series on Black women and violence. And the films that we screened for that series that sort of came after the work I had done around No and Sexual Assault Awareness Month were the film Crime After Crime, which is the story of Deborah Piegler, who was incarcerated for more than 20 years for her involvement in the death of her partner, but she had been a domestic violence survivor herself. Also, the film Treasure by Dream Hampton and Natasha Miller, which tells the story of Shelley Treasure Hilliard, who was a trans woman who was killed in Detroit in 2011. And then also the film Out in the Night by Blair DeWash Walters, which tells the story of the New Jersey Four, four queer women who were sentenced to 3.5 to 11 years in prison after they were assaulted in Greenwich Village in New York. So the point is to think about how what the work all these films are doing and the work that No did in sort of laying some of the groundwork for these films that came later. No is also important because of how it opens out onto discussions about violence writ large. I have been engaged in one form or another in researching the intersection of Black women and serial murder since shortly after 9 Black women were murdered in my hometown, Peoria, Illinois, between 2003 and 2004. And I knew one of those victims, Tammy Walls, personally. The title of my book in process is We Cannot Live Without Our Lives, which is taken from the organizing work that the Black lesbian organization, the Combahee River Collective, and other grassroots organizations did in Boston on behalf of 12 Black women who were murdered over the course of several months in early 1979. When Barbara Smith, who was one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective and the author of the pamphlet, 6 Black Women, Why Did They Die?, that the group wrote and passed around to community members while the murders were ongoing, appears in No, we also see stills of a rally the collective helped to organize in order to call attention to and protest those murders. One of their banners, which we see in the film, says, "We cannot live without our lives," which is taken from the title of a book by the activist Barbara Deming. And so while the Boston murders are not explicitly mentioned in No, they are visually referenced, and the inclusion of Barbara Smith and other organizers in the films gestures to what Smith talks about in the aforementioned pamphlet as, quote, a thread in the fabric of violence against women. I also wanted to say here that Barbara Smith talks about what galvanized her to write the pamphlet was that she was frustrated when she went to that rally on behalf of those women. And the primary folks who were talking were men men from the church community who only seemed to be able to reference what had happened to those women as racial violence, that they didn't have a language for sexual violence at all. And so that the work of that pamphlet and that Combahee River Collective did in that moment was to talk about the sort of intersections of racial violence and gender violence, and why it was so important to think about what had happened to those women as the intersection of both of those. And so know is really important in also doing this work, and so it's why it's really moving for me to see those images as part of the film. And so I also wanted to say something about the power of the testimonials, or what are also described on the jacket of the film as survivor stories, and the importance of those stories being part of the film, and how in my own experience of using the film and the work I do, how much that has registered with women. And one point has to do with sort of just the power of voice. So Janelle White says in the film, quote, "It does change your life when you're able to voice it." And so just seeing women be able to talk about what happened to them, just that process, just that visual does an important kind of work. And I've seen this in the ways in which, when I've shown the film for people. And then a point that a survivor makes about the sort of idea that they were considered first Black, then women. So this idea that you see in the clip that was just shown, that one has to condition their response to the violence that they experience based upon the fact that they are Black first. And Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons talks about sort of the second assault, I think is the term she uses to talk about what she experienced in trying to discuss her rape, and the way that she was assaulted again when she was not believed, or when she was told that to be quiet, right? And so that what that ends up doing. And Renee McNeil talks about this as well in the film, the sort of stand by your man mentality that was enforced upon them. And what the testimonials also do is sort of gesture to the unsuitability of traditional carceral responses to violence. One, because one survivor talks about police not even taking the claim seriously, again, which points to those intersections of race and gender that are so instructive and important about the film. But then what we know from the work of people like Andrea Ritchie and Sarah Haley and others who talk about, who remind us about the fact that police are often themselves perpetrators. And so one of the things I appreciate so much about the film is its ability to sort of take that seriously and think about what it means to use sort of carceral responses to violence. And then this idea of Barbara Smith of talking about rape as a thread in the fabric of violence against women. I think about this when Rosetta Williams talks about in the film. One, she talks about sort of the derogatory names that she was called, that conditioned the way she felt about herself and her sexuality and sex in general. And then how that sort of foregrounded what happened when she was assaulted. And then talks about how part of the process of going through that, the aftermath of her assault, was that she became bulimic. And so to think about what we're talking about is not, it isn't only the moment of the assault, but what all comes after that, right? That how far the thread goes, right? And we see that when Rosetta Williams tells that story. And so finally, it's no surprise, but must be said, that women like Tarana Burke and like Aisha absolutely laid the groundwork for the Me Too moment. And so the last thing I want to say before I turn it over is about what it means to think about film, think about this film right now, particularly when films like The Hunting Ground and other kinds of films and discussions that galvanized, particularly around what's called the campus rape crisis, are happening at the particular moment. And so there's sort of 3 points I want to talk about here that are critical about thinking about no at this moment. And one is that what I appreciate so much is that no deals with campus rape. So you see it in the story that Erinette White tells, that Janelle White tells. There are multiple people who talk about being on campus. But what the film is also clear about is that what we're talking about goes well beyond campus and recognizes the vulnerability of Black women and girls, most of whom do not have access to the campus, right? And refuses to make the campus the only sort of site of the violence or the harm, which I think is really important when we're thinking about this in terms of Black women. Also the important work in this regard is to think about the historical conditions of what we're talking about. So having Beverly Guy-Sheftall and Janetta B. Cole to talk about, amongst others, to talk about sort of slavery and that legacy and that the continued rape of Black women as being sort of a vestige of that slavery and that continued harm is an important work of the film as well. And finally, the role of men. So that this film confronts intraracial violence in a really meaningful way, refuses to leave men sort of out of the equation. And the moments where we see the representatives from Men Stopping Violence, and particularly Janelle White's discussion of accountability and how there is a man in her life who held her perpetrator accountable, continued to talk to him. Like, it's one of the few places where you see an actual example, where someone gives an example of what that looks like. What does it look like to have men as part of the conversation? What is the work they need to do? And the film does that really powerfully, I think. So I'm going to stop talking, but finally just want to say thank you to you for your bravery, your courage, your insight, and your wisdom, because we need it now as much as ever.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Aisha for No and this labor of love, which persists, and every time I see something new. So I'm very thankful for your work and for who you are. You're so meaningful to me as a scholar, but then also as a person. I think you call us to be better human beings. So thank you, and thank you to Terion for your comments. I wanted to start with a brief homage to Black feminists who have, in my estimation, set the trail for any kind of anti-rape movement. Without Black women, there is no anti-rape movement. So I'll begin with part one and then move into a part two. Black women cultural workers are technicians who shape-shift cultures of violence into cultures of love with accountability. Everything from the videos they display, tweets and social media posts they curate, and the photographic and filmic recordings they create embody what Black feminist scholar Tamora Lomax calls, quote, the technologies of Black women's lives, or the strategies that Black women and girls deploy to, quote, loose themselves from vapid feminine technology and bigotry which stifle radical imagination, end quote. These Black feminist and womanist technologies are not only befitting of critical scholarly engagement, but they are also indicative of the various healing and liberatory technologies that anti-rape activists such as Aisha Shahida Simmons use as they culturally and strategically dismantle anti-Black and anti-woman systems of domination. Indeed, Black feminist anti-rape activists who use contemporary technologies of resistance do so in the spirit of African foremothers, enslaved and free, even as those women did not have access to film, high-tech recording devices, text messages, and chats, or even social media. My understanding of the power of film and or other technologies of resistance builds on Jacqueline Bobo's words in Black women's films, Genesis of a Tradition, where she states, quote, mainstream cultural forms are replete with devastating representations of Black women as victims, as pawns of systemic oppressive forces, lacking the will or agency to resist. Films are instrumental in the effort by Black women filmmakers to erase destructive ideologies affecting women. With their body of socially conscious work, the filmmakers form an integral component of a cultural movement, a configuration of activists that seeks to transform the status of Black women in popular imagination and in the minds of Black women themselves. Through meticulous concentration on Black women's history, faithfully representing their lives, Black women's films magnify female viewers' perception of their material circumstances, motivating them towards activism, thereby strengthening their visibility as a potent social force, end quote. All these years after its world premiere at the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles in 2006, Aisha's No remains a Black feminist filmic and technological tool utilized in churches, on college campuses, and across the globe in the fight against rape and all forms of violence against women. No paved the way for the raw truth-telling that such projects and movements such as Me Too foster today, and it also opened the doors for many survivors to feel comfortable speaking the horrors of sexual violence that they had experienced. Such a groundbreaking body of work was the first to unapologetically detail the victimization that Black women and girls are subject to by the state and by kin. No's filmic intervention was pivotal. A post-civil rights racial justice movement could not exist, nor could it be successful if African-American leaders continued to perpetrate the violences, erasures, and silences around rape and sexual assault. And I'd also argue that the movement against rape is also a racial justice movement. And if we don't see it as a racial justice movement, we do a humongous disservice to ourselves and to our grander fight for Black liberation. Since No's release, there have been many other films, as Terrion has acknowledged. I also like to highlight Tina Marbury's Mississippi Damned. I think that film does something really, really critical in thinking about the interiority of Black family and how Black families cover the violences upon violences, such that so many things go to the grave, but then so many other things live and spiral in people's lives from birth until they die. Without question, these political mobilizations which we see through the film, or through films, right, are the result of these new age technologies that transcend the bounds of Hollywood. And so much of what Aisha does, and she often says this, is in the spirit of Toni K. Bambara's critique of Hollywood. I think she called it Holly Weird. And so thinking about the ways that white supremacy plays out in the film. And so there is a critique here about intraracial violence, but also about white supremacy and how any kind of recapitulation of rape is actually an extension of anti-Blackness. I'd like to move to think about how No is in conversation with Twitter. I've been fascinated over the years by the way Black women online speak very openly and candidly about sexual violence. And so moving beyond Darlene Clark Hines' notion of a culture of dissemblance and thinking about how Black women are very much detailing rape and street harassment. So you have Feminista Jones's hashtag #UOKSIS, Beverly Gooden's hashtag #WhyIStayed, and then there was hashtag survivor privilege. And so the videos, the tweets, the blog posts, and other materials that emerge on these hashtags, I would argue, are filmic in that they graphically and intentionally shift cultural images concerning Black women's lack of safety in Black communities. And these hashtags, again, would not be possible if it weren't for No. Part 2. While there is much more to be said about Aisha, the Black feminist, out lesbian, cultural worker, and survivor of rape and incest, and of No, I wish to focus in on its deconstruction of sexual violence in the church and in Black religious spaces more broadly. So many who wear sacred collars desecrate churches and the gospel with their unrelenting commitments to sexual violence. Without doubt, our society perpetuates rape culture, but many of the church's religious leaders prey on those who often cannot pray for themselves. They also theologically nurture and coddle those who violate children, women, and queer folks, and we must reckon with the reality that survivors of sexual abuse sit in pews and preach in pulpits, often with their harm doers in plain view. Yet black churches are largely silent. The Nation of Islam is largely silent, and so many other black cultural and religious institutions are largely silent. Indeed, the collective silence from adults, from the village, from the elders is deafening, even as childhood screams, women's screams, queer folk screams, hollers, and pleas to live unbothered and untouched by the perversions of sexual abuse blare the silences. With regards to child sexual abuse in particular, my work as the founder of Children of Kumbihi, which is an organization that works to end sexual violence in black churches, and also my thinking as a scholar of religion has three aims, aims that I see as only being possible through the black feminist anti-rape technologies of resistance embodied by my survivor sibling, Aisha. First, I like to think that I'm building a canon of thought within black religion and theology that names sexual violence as sexual deviance and reconsiders longstanding pathologies which situate homosexuality or gender nonconformity, womanhood, and other marginalized sexual and gender identities as not only deviant, but subservient to black male cis heteropatriarchy. Second, I am deconstructing the myth that queer subjects, both within and outside the black church, are queer because of sexual abuse, and I'm offering new ways of thinking about pathology and perversion within the black church. And third, I contend that lived experience, personal testimony, or survivor stories, and the psychic realities that are both worthy and befitting of critical theological attention and engagement, in part because most survivor narratives never make it into the academy or church archives, even as the assaults and remembrances and effects of the assaults are archived or repressed within survivors' minds. It is important to note that many of the terminologies that are engaged in a film like No actually are never spoken in churches. I've never heard consent actually spoken. It's assumed, but it's never spoken or taught. Rape is alluded to, but it's never acknowledged. The survivor is shunned, but the harm doer is praised. I mean, the image of Mike Tyson being brought to the pulpit to be celebrated by that cadre of black men, and even the black women who are, was raising the flag in celebration and valoration of the violence that he enacted on Desiree. These terms, they, as No shows us, function as guiding principles in the fight to end sexual violence. So perhaps what I'm thinking through is how do we translate these vocabularies of anti-rape activism into black religious spaces? What does that actually look like? What does that do? And I think womanist theologians and scholars have led the charge in that work. But again, I don't believe the black church in particular will be able to stop rape until black men, black male pastors, outrightly denounce rape and perhaps repent for their own perpetrations against black women. Again, Aisha's No provides tools, language, and survivor testimony to be utilized by religious practitioners in order to stop rape and its sadistic sacralizations. For Aisha's boldness and willingness to cry aloud and spare not, lift up her voice as a trumpet and show us our sins, I give many, many thanks. For No and its prophetic rumination and beckoning call, I say Ashe and Amen. Thank you.
So now I would like to be in conversation with both of you. I do want to just kind of share just some thoughts and thinking about No in this moment, and there's certain things. There used to be a time when people would say, are there things, there used to be a time when I would say, oh, I look at No and I feel like everything is fine, like I'm happy, 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 and I am happy with No. There are things that I would do differently, and one line that just really, it hits me, and it's so amazing, and I credit being in community with Ahmad and others. We are members of a fellowship cohort, the Just Beginnings Collaborative Cohort of survivor leaders, most of whom, all of people of color, most of whom are queer, trans people of color, but definitely all people of color. survivors of child sexual abuse. So no does not talk about child sexual abuse head on. It alludes to it, it dances around it, it kind of touches it. And that's about where I was at the time when I was making No. I was not able to talk about sexual violence, child sexual abuse, because I couldn't talk about it in my own life. And what I have made the commitment to do is whenever I talk about No, is that I have to situate something. So both my parents are in No, and they're incredible people. Dr. Gwendolyn Zahar Simmons and Michael Simmons are my divorced parents, long-term revolutionaries, radicals, in various movements for social change. I always say I was conceived in struggle. They're in the film, and powerful testimonies and commentary, and they did not protect me when I told them when I was 10 years old that I was being sexually violated by my grandfather. And I share this to really talk about the complexities, the interiority, and to quote both of you, or paraphrase both of you, in the context of, here I am, the survivor, the child sexual abuse survivor and adult rape survivor, but child sexual abuse survivor, making a film about breaking silences in Black communities, having my parents in there, and everything that they have to say is valid and on point, but also not interrogating on screen or even off screen. What does it mean, given your acute understanding about sexual violence and my mother being a survivor, what does it mean that you didn't protect your child? And these are the complicated conversations that we have to have. And so I'm talking about my family, but then No talking about the quote unquote bigger family, right? How do we talk about and have these difficult conversations around sexual violence and sexual violation of children and adults? So I just think that that's really important, which has led me to my project, Love with Accountability, which looks at how do we name, address, interrupt, and end child sexual abuse in communities of African descent, diasporic. So No looks at rape of cisgender women, Black cisgender women by Black cisgender men. Love with Accountability is including voices of survivors who are cisgender, transgender, gender nonconforming, African American, Caribbean, Latinx, Ghanaian. Advocates. My mother's in there, so she actually breaks her silence publicly about what does it mean for her to have been a bystander to her daughter, myself, child sexual abuse in the context of her own survival, and then just her long-standing work around around violence against women. So that's just something, and just wanting to, because that's not on screen, and I made No in 2006, and Love with Accountability was created in 2016. Then in 2019, an anthology is coming out of writings of 44 survivors, one of whom is Ahmad, where we're all wrestling with these issues. And so I think it's really important to name these things, right? And also to name it and to explore. When I say, contradictions it is real, it is contradictions, but also the complexities of this work and why we don't talk about it. So we can hear we can talk about white supremacy all day, and we need to, in ways in which we will not talk about patriarchy and misogyny and other forms of violence in our communities. And as Terrion was just sharing, in terms of to use the organizations saying survived and punished. What happens when you do protect yourself if you have been battered or raped, and if you're a person of color, specifically Black women, Black femmes, gender nonconforming people, they're in jail. They're in jail. So they survive the violence, they defend themselves, and they're in jail. Meanwhile, white vigilantes are not. And I don't advocate for jails. I believe in community accountability. I believe in transformative justice and restorative justice. They're not the same, but these are just models in terms of how can we hold folks accountable without discarding them and centering survivors. And when I say without discarding them, I think it's important because there are millions of survivors, and then there are millions of harm doers. People use the word perpetrators. I try to use harm doers. And then there are millions of bystanders. And so even if we wanted to, let's just say, lock up everybody, we can't. Everybody be in jail, practically. So that's not going to work, and I don't advocate for that. So then we have to think about how are we going to end this pandemic, how this inhumane pandemic, humanely. So, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question about, so in the work I do around serial murder, one of the conversations I've had with someone in community is the need, while it's important for me to do the scholarly work that I'm doing, that there also needs to be another element, that there needs to be a visual component, that there needs to be a performance component to be able to get at that just the sort of written word, particularly the scholarly word, is not enough to sort of get at what has happened and the way that those deaths have continued to resonate within the community. And so the question is then, what do those performance pieces that you include, the poetry and the performance pieces that you include, and know your decision to include those and the work that you think that they do in telling the story?
Well, No would not exist without so much, right? And so No is influenced by For Color Girls Who Consider Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. It is influenced by Marlon Riggs's Tongues Untied, Black Is, Black Ain't, Julie Dash's films. So what I wanted to, for me, many people cannot say they've been raped. They cannot say they've been battered, they've been abused, but they have a poem that can say that. And my sister, Tamara Xavier, Dr. Tamara Xavier, who's one of the co-producers and director of choreography of No, when we started working on this film in 1994, we were 23, and she was 23, I was 25. She said, she pushed me, because she was like, we have to include movement. She said, that it's not, we have to talk about how the body is, is evidence, how the body is a site of trauma. And so that it is not just speaking about it, but it is also talking about how it impacts us. And I was very resistant, because I was like, well, no, we'll talk about therapy, we'll get psychologists, we'll do the mental thing. And she was like, she pushed me, and I am forever grateful. And so that was really important. So in terms of, and particularly at the end of No, having that healing dance, and she is the performer and the choreographer of that piece for Women of Rage and Reason, to just really, it's kind of reclamation of the body. And so that was really important. And in the poetry, with Essex Hemphill, with Honoré Fanon Jeffers and Samia Bashir, both are kind of calling out and naming, and also I think just to give another way to engage how we're going to talk about these issues. So I really just, I thought it was, after Tamara helping me to understand around movement, was just kind of also, not interludes like let's take a break. It is interludes of like, let's use another part of our mind-body phenomena in terms of to engage these issues. And particularly like with the dance migration piece by Dr. Aminata Baruti, was just also like, there aren't women who I could interview around talking about migration from the South to the North and all the sexual violence that happened along that way, and speaking as a descendant of one of my grandmothers said that was her reality, definitely. And so just really getting us to visualize what that is. And then also enslavement, that the enslavement, the vignettes during slavery. And it's so interesting because No came out in 2006. I filmed a lot of it in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it's like before 12 Years a Slave, before so much of these things. So at the time, I was just like, we need to depict the horrors of enslavement, and particularly I wanted to contradict this kind of myth of like folks working in a house were having a good time in juxtaposition to the people to the enslaved folks in the field, that it was all horrible. And as a filmmaker, the point of view, we're always looking at the woman or the victim, the survivor being raped. So it's like, it's the point of view of the perpetrator. I have the camera looking up at him who is raping, because I was like, no, we need to see his face. And so to put ourselves in that position. And I credit just a pantheon of Black independent filmmakers and culture workers and poets to, seeing those films. I was like, that's what I want to do with No.
I was, of course, struck by your inclusion of the clips of, the National Baptist Convention preacher, and then the Nation of Islam, in particular, Louis Farrakhan. The rhetoric, especially Farrakhan's notion that you can say no over and over and over again, but that still means yes. And then he called women who say no deceitful. And so just thinking about the permanence of that kind of rhetoric, what it does, what it suggests about a larger culture. And so just wondering, and then also with the Baptist Convention preacher, the way that the entire congregation was riled by the call to love both parties, to love Desiree and to love Mike equally. And I hear your work calling for love indeed, but with accountability. And so what does that actually look like? And so I guess my question is, has the National Baptist Convention or the Nation of Islam, how have they responded to their depictions in the film? If at all, have they responded? And then a larger question too about change over time, if such a thing exists with Farrakhan. I've just really have been struck by how the rhetoric persists, and yet these individuals are still heralded as leaders of Black liberation. And what does that do alongside Black women's efforts to speak back, but to lead the charge for the movement for Black lives, and also with Me Too. And so so essentially there's a cultural dichotomy between these two bodies, such that it seems to me that Black men in particular, who see themselves as race men, race representatives today still, cannot deal with sexual violence. And so just wondering about your own critiques of Black cultural institutions, including the Black Church and the Nation of Islam, but also of Black men.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The first time I saw the footage, actually it comes from The Fallen Champ by Academy Award-winning filmmaker Barbara Koppel, who made a documentary on Mike Tyson. So we can just help so I contacted her, and this was in the 90s. And then the second time I saw that footage was in Black Is, Black Ain't by Marlon Riggs. And so it's so interesting, right? Because we're in 2018. I guess if somebody were making a film, if I were making No Now, I'm sure it'd be Bill Cosby and R. Kelly would be the centerpiece. So Mike Tyson is the centerpiece, and I just wanted to take a pause. What's very interesting is I screened the film to folks who weren't even alive, literally weren't born at that time, and they have no idea. And yet I can talk about O.J. Simpson, and they know exactly who I'm talking about. So I just think, and I juxtapose that because it's around the same time. I was making during the the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings where Anita Hill was summoned to talk about the sexual harassment that she endured by him during the Mike Tyson trial and during O.J. Simpson. So and before social media, before anything, and as a young 20-something out-dyke rape survivor, it was hell making the film. But I think that it is really deep, and not deep, right? That folks know who O.J. is in ways in which that they don't know who Mike Tyson is. He was on Broadway. Spike Lee made a film. He's just still celebrated. And you cannot tell me that if Desiree Washington had been a white woman, particularly at that time period, that she would, what would happen there. So I knew that, so that is partly why the Mike Tyson case is the kind of climax. And I thought it was really important, as somebody who was raised Muslim, as somebody whose uncle, John Ali, was the national secretary of the Nation of Islam under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So this is not, and I share this in the context of just be able to situate myself. This is not like I'm going after these folks. It is, I'm holding them accountable for the violence that they are perpetrating through the use of their power. So that when you say, sisters, how many times have you said no and you mean yes all the time? When you say both of them belong to us and you only have Mike Tyson on the stage, you're not bringing Desiree Washington and saying both of them belong to us, and brother, you're going to be accountable for the harm that you've done, caused this woman. That would be one thing, but no. And so, because no, up until recently, has not, when I say hasn't been accessible, it's been accessible. You could order it online, you could screen it at colleges and universities, but it was never on television. And it's not because I didn't try, that there were networks that said, you know, let's face it, most people in America don't care about the rape of black women and girls. Mainstream cable networks, public television, funding letters that said the fact that can't be denied, that the moral point of view in the black community is that a woman shouldn't be in a man's room at 2 a.m. in the morning. This was part of the rationale for not giving me a grant. So let me just also say that no would not exist were it not for black feminist-led queer fundraising. The first foundation that gave one dime to no was the Estrella Foundation, Lesbian Foundation for Justice. Sonia Sanchez, the poet, was the first person who gave a major donation, as well as a lesbian couple, and activist Pat Clark and Inell Cox Bagwell. So in terms of that, I just need to situate that part of it taking 12 years, 11 to 12 years, is because it was, you know, bit by bit, and I was committed to paying the predominantly black women crew the rates that they wanted to. I didn't ask them to donate their labor. And so for me, what was really important was to really, to get us to look at this footage, because people have seen that footage, but not in the context of talking about sexual violence. And so I situated to say, let's talk about this in terms of sexual violence, that we go through enslavement, we go through civil rights and black power, second wave of black feminism, campus rape, and it wasn't even titled that. At that point, it wasn't even called that. In fact, people told me that it was ridiculous for me to have campus rape in no at the time, which is so fascinating in this moment. That then to situate it there and to put it in conversation with black feminists, womanist theologians, black male activists against gender violence, black women leaders, like Elaine Brown, Janetta Cole, to really situate it and say, what are we saying here? So no, they haven't responded, and I say that because no has still, as much as it has been screened, it still hasn't reached mainstream. In some ways, it's been probably for my benefit, though there was a screening when I was still fundraising at Simmons College. The black woman filmmaker, deceased now, Elizabeth Hadley Freudberg, organized it, and along with Black Women's Health Project, Lula Christopher, and Tijuana Malone, they organized it, and there were some members, women members from the nation, and they were so upset, not at the footage, and then they reached out to the leadership, and then I got a call, and it was a veiled threat, that I needed to take the footage out, and I did not, and I was like, and I will not, and that was before the film got big or whatever, but got completed, never got paid in that way. So for me, every time that I see it, it's so painful, and in thinking about, you know, sister, mothers, you know, just singer beyond singing, Aretha Franklin's funeral, it's very painful in terms of just now the visual. We could get into the whole, this is not what this panel is about, of all those men up there, and how folks are still celebrated and valorized, as you put it. And what pains me is, this is why I talked about the contradictions with my family, because I was just like, we have got to learn how to hold these tensions. We've got to learn how to hold these tensions and be like, yes, brother, your race analysis may be on point, is on point around these kinds of things, but your gender stuff is off. Your sexuality stuff is off. And you have to be accountable for the fact that Desiree Washington had to change her name. She had to live in hiding. And why? Because she talked about sexual violence. So we're looking at Dr. Ford, Christine Blasey Ford, and all that she went through, and contemporarily, and how she had to go in hiding as well. And I just think about Desiree Washington and how she was just demonized and ripped across the coals. I mean, it was just outrageous, and the power that these pulpits are play in our communities, and how so many women who have been directly impacted by sexual violence will then turn around and blame women who come forward. And I do think part of that is because nobody affirmed what happened to them. And almost rape becomes it's like a hazing process. It's I've heard survivors say, particularly those who've been assaulted within their family. One woman told me, who was raped by her father, that her mother was like, "You don't think I was raped by my father?" Like, and so just that pain, and how do we hold that tension? Thinking about Precious, the film, and one of my critiques about many critiques, but at the ending, is how Monique's character reveals that she was abused, and we don't. And it's just kind of there, and it's not to excuse the abuse that she inflicts upon her child, but we have got to figure out about how we're going to deal with this generational abuse. Not only generational abuse, but generational perpetuation of violence in religious and sacred spaces. Because most people do not go to rape crisis centers. They do not have, either they're not seeing a therapist because they don't want to, or they don't have the funds. They're turning to their clergy, they're turning to their imams, their pastors, their babalaos. And if these folks don't have an understanding about sexual violence, if these folks are guilty of committing sexual violence, then they are going to inflict, and I know, Ahmad, you can speak deeper to this, spiritual violence, which is at a whole nother level. So your physical body has been invaded against your will and violated, and then the place where you turn to for salvation, for healing, then violates you again. And so then it gets compounded, and then you just pass it on generation to generation. Yeah, and so I think it is, and the challenge, right, is that you see, I know that Farrakhan has come under, Minister Farrakhan has come under tremendous, racist, vitriolic attacks, and, you see it. So then how do I hold, so I'm expected to then, stand firm as a Black person who's devoid of gender. But then I'm like, brothers, when are you going to stand firm? Isn't it, am I Black too? Right? What are we doing here? And so that becomes that problem, because I saw that, in terms of the March for Women, how Sister Tamika Mallory was defending Farrakhan, and she doesn't even probably know about this stuff. I'm not holding her responsible for that. I'm just saying, how do we have these dialogues, right, around that? And one of the things I always say is that we're so busy trying to stop a lynching of a Black man, usually, because we tend to not run to the races for Black women, that we can't even deal with the violence that is going on in our lives day in, day out, for the sake of the community. But community gets defined as masculine, heterosexual, cisgender. If we're talking about the sake of the community, then we would be like, we got to deal with all of this and now.
This will be my final. And I guess I have a couple of points that are questions that are sort of connected. And one is just to ask you how you think resonates at this moment. Like, how do you think about it in the context of what Me Too has become, or what it references or cites at this point? And a sort of related question is about what it means for you to have made no. And I'm thinking about this again in the context of the work I do, and something that I've been starting to experience, where there's a thing about a Black woman writing about Black women, talking about Black women, that gets less traction in certain kinds of ways, right? So I think about how, in doing work around serial killing, there's a film that came out a couple years ago by this white filmmaker around this case of this man, Lonnie Franklin, who has been sort of sensationalized as the Grim Sleeper. And he does this film, and it shows up on HBO, and it's all of this, right? And it's like, how do you have and then there's all of these things that happen in the film that make me so uncomfortable about how he's accessing people, how he's accessing the community, how he's not keeping people safe. I'm like, how are you taking care of your folks? I mean, you literally see someone in the film who ends up getting beat up because he's been on camera. And it's like, what is your ethics of care for this community that you're going into? And I think about how, as a Black woman trying to do this work around something that has been so invisible for so long, that I have all these ethics that stop me from being able to do the real quick film, or to do the real quick, sort of put the real quick book out there. Like, there's all this other kind of work that I have to do. Like, when you talk about all of the time and all of it went into making No, right? I think there had to be an ethics of how you went about doing this work. And so I'm interested in you saying something about that and sort of your position as a Black woman survivor, like all of those ways in which you identify yourself and what it's meant for you specifically to do that work.
Thank you. So I'm a survivor. I dropped out of college in my sophomore year. I was raped and had consensual sex. The next night, a different person came home pregnant. Was fortunate to have a safe and legal abortion in 1989 when I was 20, and then had the great fortune of going to Spain with my father, where I talked about I was going to get in debt over a film and not a degree, and then coming back from Spain and meeting Tony K. Bombara. So it's just like woo, 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 woo. Tamara Xavier, Dr. Tamara Xavier, and I spent 4 years from 1994 to 1998 raising money, but also doing research on sexual violence in Black communities. Because when I first started working on No, I wasn't even going to deal with enslavement or have Black men in the film or talk about religion. It was just going to be like a speak out piece. I saw it in a tradition of For Colored Girls. I saw it as a cinematic version of that at a different generation, of course. And then it was because I couldn't get any money, and not only because of the topic of the film, but also because of my being unapologetically out as a dyke and being young, that we then had these screenings, and then people were like, how are you going to talk about a brother? How are you going to, all these kinds of things that I was like, oh my God, we got to deal with enslavement. We got to talk about lynching and how Black women were at the forefront of the anti-lynching movement. We got to revisit SNCC and Black power movements through the voices and experiences of Black feminist, womanist leaders of these movements. We've got to talk about how rape is a weapon, used as a weapon of homophobia. I mean, it was just all of these things. It was very important, and again, it was like no social media. Like, I was like going to conferences, handing out flyers. There was barely email was in existence. It was just like pre-AOL almost. Like, it just was just intense thinking about it. But I will say that thinking about technology and stuff, like, it's powerful. I'm grateful for it. But I'm so glad that I had to make the No the way I had to make it. And let me just say, this is hindsight. It was not cute, single digits in the checking account. But it made me, in the words of Tony K. Bombara, accountable to my community. Because initially I wasn't getting funding, major funding. And so I was getting dollars, and at that point it was like lira and francs. This was before the euro, from folks who were giving money. So I was accountable to those people, not to the foundations who have their funding priorities and all that. So by the time Ford Foundation came in, and I'm very grateful that they came in because it made No accessible in a global market, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, subtitled, a study guide, a supplemental video, No was done. So but when they co-signed, it was just about done, like they did post-production, but it was like the vision was there. I know I got so much resistance up to that because there are no white experts in No, and that's important because my thing was like, we are going to talk about sexual violence. We have the expertise. We got it all. We can resolve this ourselves, right? That was very key. It was very important to see Black women as experts, which is why, as a dropout of college, I have the credentials on there. Not to be like, la, 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 they got a PhD. It is because we don't see Black women as experts. And so if we don't have the PhD by our names, people don't think, oh, there's no assumption. There's the assumption is that they don't have it. That was very, very important to me. It was to challenge the classist myth that the only people who sexually assault are folks from the hood, folks who are living in government housing, folks who are on food stamps. Yes, they are being sexually assaulted in terms of what's happening in these very marginalized, invisible communities. But sexual violence is happening in Black revolutionary movements, it's happening in institutions, it's happening in churches and mosques. And so I think that it was critical that we deal with that and challenge this respectability politics. So, because there are some folks who've been like, well, she doesn't have real Black people in the film. I don't know what that means, but my whole point was like, no, these are the folks, and this is why we have to talk about it. Because if we will not acknowledge what is happening in these movements, then it's just the most marginalized will never be acknowledged. And so it was just very important for me to challenge that classist myth. That was very intentional. I also wanted to have the survivors that we see their faces and we have their first and last name. So I was very clear with everyone that that was my goal. So everyone who agreed, they knew what they were signing up for. And because I really wanted to convey the message on screen that the shame should never be on us, that we shouldn't have to hide, though many of us do. It was very important that we see the survivors, we hear their stories of victimization, but then we see them in terms of at the end in what they've done, how they've turned, transformed or working to transform their victimization to survivorhood, to resilience, to resistance. So that was also important, and that the survivors were also the experts. So it wasn't like we got the survivors here and we got the experts there. That was very, very critical and important to me. And then including the voices of Black men who have not perpetrated, knock on wood, violence. and that was important, not because it is important to see and have films where we understand what's going on, and definitely men are not the only harm doers. All humans commit violence and all humans experience violence. But in terms of to not focus on that, because I think that can then just shift us, right? So then we got to understand what's going on, that we don't center the voices of Black women, and we don't center the voices of anti-sexist, pro-Black feminist Black men. And one thing I learned from Tony Cabron-Barr, from Julie Dash, is that we are not trained to experience Black women's lives on screen. Now, things have changed radically. So this is 2018. I started in 1994. So that what film does is ask you to experience, to identify with the protagonist, which is why Julie Dash had so much resistance. I mean, now the film is celebrated for the masterpiece, and it changed my life. I saw it about 30 times when it first came out. And it is because for 2 hours she's saying, experience Black women's lives through Black women. And so that's what I'm saying that we're going to experience this international atrocity through the experiences and expertise of Black women. We are going to talk about rape through Black women's experiences. And so that was really important. And even the set of filming the women survivors, it was lots of good food. The crew was all Black, predominantly Black women. And so it was a closed set. I asked them to tell their stories. I did not interrogate them. This was not a witness stand. It was a way to say that I believe you. What you say happened. I don't have to go, wait a minute, you did this, you did that. No, I'm not doing that. And then the crew also asked questions. So that it was a Black feminist space behind the camera as much as it was in front of the camera. And I think that's part of the reason, honestly, not that it hasn't been screened and being used across this country and internationally, because it is, but in terms of a screening on HBO, Showtime, Lifetime, PBS, you name it, I think, and particularly when it first came out, it was just challenging too much. That they were not willing and able to handle it. And now I put it on Vimeo on demand. I just did it a few weeks ago because I was holding on to my baby, trying to protect it. But then I just realized, I made to do her work in the world. And part of her being able to do her work in the world is, yes, you can get a DVD, but that you can also just watch it online. There's a 100-page study guide co-authored by Salamisha Tillett and Rachel Afi-Quinn, which is downloadable. And so really wanting it to be a resource, an educational and organizing resource tool. and really honoring those voices and perspectives in there. I'm glad, I mean, I say this now, I kept thinking it was gonna happen overnight, that black people were gonna support it. It was like when Spike Lee's film, Get on the Bus came out, and all these black men gave $100,000 for it. I was like, that's what's gonna happen to me. It was, I mean, it's hilarious, so to think about it. But that long haul made, the comprehensive film that it is. And as I said in the opening, because I just really want to be clear, we're talking about knowing the age of Me Too, and it's not in opposition to the important work and vision of my sister, survivor, comrade, Tarana Burke. It is in tandem with. We both live. I'm from Philly. She used to live in Philadelphia. Have worked with Tarana, and she has been very, very clear that Me Too, while anybody can access it, the vision was for black and brown women and girls, and that's the way I feel like that and it has been. I've screened the film where it was just me and the people in No were the only people who were black and who spoke English, and folks said this is my story, and so No it's looking at an international atrocity. It's just asking you to experience it, interrogate, reflect upon the issues through black people. It's a black feminist lens. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, and if you want to know more about No, it's knowtherapedocumentary.org. Thank you.